Welcome to Deciphering Growth, the show that explores mental health from every angle. We bring you conversations with personal opinions, stories, and practical tips. We aim to break down the stigma and help you live your best life. So please sit back and let's dive in. Before we begin, we want to remind our listeners that this podcast represents the opinions of Tiffany Graves, Eric Stone, and the show's guests. The content here should not be used as medical advice. It is for informational purposes only, and please consult your healthcare professional for any medical questions. Views and opinions expressed in the podcast are our own and do not represent that of our places of work. This podcast should not be in any legal capacity whatsoever, including but not limited to establishing a standard of care in a legal sense or as a basis for expert witness testimony. There is no guarantee regarding the accuracy of any statements or opinions made on the podcast. In no way does listening, reading, emailing, or interacting on social media with our content establish a doctor-patient relationship.
All right, guys, we're back for another episode on grief. Eric is bringing us a special topic on grief that I think is going to be very interesting, and we're going to put him on the hot seat with some Q&A.
You did get me on the hot seat a lot last time, so I feel like you did warn me before coming in today. We're still discussing grief, which is, just a heavy topic for just about anyone. So one of the things that I'm really passionate about is working with substance use clients and addiction. One of the things that is complicated about this, and so that you may be like, this isn't a grief podcast. I think that addiction comes with grief all across the spectrum. Grief of a life you thought you were going to have, a life that you're living, maybe the life of someone you care about is living or what they're not living anymore, parent to child, child to parent, friend, partner. There's just so many different types of grief that could be kind of wrapped up in those scenarios. And then probably the heaviest part to get into today is the grief of someone who is dead, deceased, and gone. And I feel like these days, Tiffany, and you can maybe be my sounding board, I'm not aware of anyone that doesn't have a friend, family member, neighbor, someone a few degrees away from them that's been impacted by substance use or addiction. Like, what have you maybe noticed for your clientele or the connections you have? Like, I know that's a very big statement, but at this point, that's probably a statement we can justify.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to the idea of substance use and abuse, I think that that's starting to encapsulate a lot of different things these days, um, and it's starting to touch a lot more people, and people are starting to understand the difference between simple usage versus abuse. And it does touch a lot of people, and it can be a really hard topic just to even admit that, like, there's individuals in your lives that struggle with those types of things.
Yeah. So
And
go for it.
I'm sorry.
No, no, no.
I was
Don't be
just
sorry.
gonna the grief aspect that pops into mind for me is like it's a double-edged sword. Like the grief that comes from the person who's struggling personally with that, that life struggle, and then the person on the other side who, has to watch a loved one go through that and grieving that process for them and kind of grieving, all the things that individual is experiencing and potentially, you know, the loss of who they used to know and the change in that person.
Yeah. And I think just something to say is, I think most folks are familiar with the stages of grief, anger, depression, sadness, bargaining. I don't personally use that model much these days. So kind of like what we got into the last episode, the ball in the box or ball and the button in the box. Like there's so many different analogies as we learned doing that episode. But what we're not doing here is saying like when you're in anger with grief, that is wrong, but also useful. And this is what I mean. Sometimes folks are grieving, I think more of parents or partners grieving like a relationship, grieving a life that someone is still living and dealing with. And it is so hard not to get angry at drugs,
Mhm.
angry at maybe people you think that impacted them to be in that point. And I just need to say, like, I have yet to have met a client that having someone be super angry, cutting them up and down, left, right, center, unasked for, that's been helpful. And the reason I say unasked for is like, that sometimes is a relationship of a sponsor to a sponsee in some of the 12-step programs. There are some folks that's the style they want and would benefit from is a very direct conversation. So the reason I want to just make that caveat is because when we're angry, that our parent isn't the person we want them to be, or our child isn't doing the things we thought they could be doing, or maybe the things that are happening because of a substance, it is so fair to be angry. And that situation is not fair at all. That some folks can try something one time and that is a door that almost never shuts for them, and other folks can dabble and be fine. And so like the whole thing's not fair. And so just before I really go in, if you're listening to this and your family or friends or someone close to you has been impacted by addiction and you're really carrying that wound, I cannot recommend enough Al-Anon. That is a 12-step program for friends and family of those impacted by addiction. It's a wonderful program. It is a free program. There are meetings everywhere. It is a non-judgmental space, anonymity, protection, all of it. And if you're like, well, no, that doesn't really apply to me, like NAMI has mental health support groups, but this is not something we're meant to deal with alone. And so I think one of the things that I just grieve personally is that I have lost people to death by overdose. And when we're talking about addiction, pretty much every single death by overdose or addiction is an avoidable death. So, are we all going to die someday? Yeah. And that is a very scary thought for most of us. But an avoidable death, right? That's a tragedy. Like every single death by overdose is a tragedy. There is another way that person could have died, and if that was the way they had died, it would have, you know, given them more life, more time. And addiction is just this very all-consuming thing when it becomes addiction. And so something I would maybe just specify, there are lots of people who abuse substances. There are lots of people who misuse substances, dabble with substances. That is not the same thing as addiction. And so I'm not. I feel like I'm hearing folks in my group that if I were in one of my substance use groups right now, someone may have a different opinion. That's okay. But just being general, addiction is when there are symptoms noticeably happening, more than just cravings, more than just tolerance. Life is being negatively impacted in different ways, withdrawal, overdose, different things like that. But one thing that people really get wrong about addiction is thinking, well, I've never had withdrawal, so I'm not addicted. That is not necessary to meet criteria for addiction. It is not. Some folks do not know that and think, well, hey, I've never had a hangover. That's not always what people think it means. They're like, oh, I don't have a problem because I don't have a hangover. That could just mean you have an extremely high tolerance, and that is why you're not having a hangover. Uh, so I just say that of like, there's a lot of grief, and so I carry some of that grief. I think a lot of my colleagues who are substance use counselors, but more importantly than that, there are so many friends and family and communities just still grieving. The addiction crisis epidemic has started and tore through their town. It's never left. It's like a bad guest you just can't get rid of. It's still actively going on, and it's just upsetting. And so that's something where I think just it's still upsetting, and we've lost a lot of people. And I don't know, Tiffany, is there anything you're thinking of, like, as I'm talking just about this grief that's just kind of a societal grief for all we've lost?
Yeah, I'm a little curious, like from your perspective and your work with this, what are the different ways that you've observed this type of grief show up in your clientele, um, and kind of what it looks like?
That's a good question. Lots of anger, lots of like anger at the world, anger at like society, sadness, self-medicating. pain, trauma is traumatic. Uh, Very often when I'm working with my substance use clients, every single one of them has lost probably on two hands the amount of people they've lost. Very often they've overdosed. Very often they have witnessed multiple overdoses. Uh, and if you've never been around an overdose, like it is very intense. It's like, if someone was having a heart attack at the ER, like it's that level of disturbance. Like they can die if they are not tended to and revived. And so just to think about like that's what someone can get used to. We think about first responders, how tough that is, like EMTs, folks working in the ER, just how traumatic that is, even if that's your job, which you're choosing in some capacity, how that impacts you, how it's very hard to just be around that and not let that start to impact you. So you think about that as someone is addicted to a substance, and then because of that, not just that would be a problem and challenge on its own, then you have um, things that come with that life. Very often, female clients in recovery have been trafficked in some form, whether that is they traded sex for drugs or they were trafficked for drugs, or maybe, you know, manipulated into that situation. It really is appalling to me because if you've ever encountered someone in withdrawal or from a substance or addict, that's not someone in a frame of mind to give consent. That's not somebody that's going to be able to advocate for themselves, and it's just a very problematic situation. And so basically I'm just trying to say this is very complicated. We could get into all the nuances, uh, into the tragic. Like it's tragic that people are trying to just stay alive and live long enough to figure out what's going on with them. Um, yeah, it's just I think just pain and tragedy and sadness, like, everywhere. And the reason I say that is that, like, it's just no one is happy. Like, the person that's in addiction is not happy with the situation they're in. That's not what they wanted to be when they were a little kid. This isn't how they wanted their life to turn out. And I think it's all painful, it's all a tragedy, and it's just that. And I also just would have to say, I was in a group really recently with substance use clients, and I said there's just some decisions we all make that can impact certain outcomes in substance use, and they try to say, "Aha, it's not a disease, it's just decisions you make." And I was like, "No, you're wrong. Like your brain can't on a substance and addiction is not making the same, like weighing pros and cons and deciding on things. So it's very difficult to get into recovery. So yeah, are they making decisions? Sure, but they're impaired making decisions. Is impaired decision making, that's not them. That's like, what the impact of addiction is. But this person thought they had me because I said there's decisions to make, but they're really not fully being made by that person. It's being made at some level by a brain that's on fire, thinking it's dying and trying to stay alive. And I just have a stat, and this is why, like, I'm just very somber talking about this. Like in 2023, overdose death rate topped 112,000 people last year, and that's like such a large number. And those numbers are from the CDC. Like 112,000 people gone. So just to average that out, it's like a death every 4.5 minutes by overdose alone.
That's insane.
Yeah. And I think I am so sad because we have done a lot to challenge the stigma of addiction as a society and knowing that those people have value and worth and need help. And yet there's always a more powerful drug being developed. First, it was like, you go crack, then heroin, then fentanyl and carfentanil, but now it's laced and mixed. Like it's almost never been deadlier to be a user of drugs or an abuser of
Hmm.
drugs or be addicted to drugs. And that's what folks don't really, I think, understand. And so basically, if you listen to this and no one remembers anything else I said, like 0.02% of these folks dying by overdose are intentionally trying to hurt themselves and die by suicide. Like 99.9.8% of death by overdose is an accidental overdose. That is not someone trying to kill themselves. They're trying to stay flat, stay normal, stay alive. They are not trying to die. And so that is where I think I will get very spicy if someone tells me like, well, that's on them. They made a decision. It's like, people don't deserve to die because they use drugs. They don't deserve not to have housing. And I don't want to go on too much. There's so many ways you could go about this, but it seems very apparent to me the folks who haven't been as impacted by addiction seem to have some very hot takes, and
Mm-hmm.
typically those change when someone they care about or love is being impacted by addiction. And I'm glad that not everyone has gone through this, but it's also like, we need to be better as a society to not only care about things that impact someone we know. Very often when we know someone, something's happening, then we care about something. But it's like, I think it's just a tragedy all around.
Yeah. So putting myself in the shoes of someone who might be experiencing a loved one that's going through this, how can I support them in a way that doesn't trigger more trauma or more negative emotions?
Well, great question. Um, the opposite of addiction is connection. You make a chemical connection in your brain when you use a substance. So a key to healing is those connections, like what's at stake if I continue to use this. At the same time, I'm not saying be a doormat, give people an active addiction loads of cash, say whatever, say whatever they want, do whatever they want. So that's not what I'm saying. So sometimes we have to have some nuances with this, but they need to know you love them. Love doesn't mean you enable all behaviors. Love means, though, hey, I am going to still visit you in jail. I am going to try to keep talking to you, and so you got to have boundaries. I understand. And I'm not saying we have to stay. If, I think more for people with a romantic partnership that's impacted by addiction, that's very tough. And so I'm not trying to say you have to carry that, but truly people will heal when they are connected or reconnected with their community, and they have reasons to change and reasons not to go back. That does not mean if a person in addiction or recovery relapses that they didn't care enough. That relapse happen all the time. They're a part of recovery. This is probably the toughest thing every single person in recovery will have to do, is change their life almost completely from how they were running it.
Mm.
So what would be helpful, I think, just speaking words of kindness. You don't have to like, this happens all the time. I've lost track of, almost every substance use client I've ever had has said, I've had family, they say really judgy stuff. They're like, oh, okay, yeah, you're changing. Okay, yeah, well, it's only 30 days or it's only 60 days. It's only a year. Come find me, da, 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 da. Like, and I understand the anger that place comes from, but stuff like that, honestly, if you have nothing nice to say, maybe just don't say anything at all. You don't have to compliment and affirm, but uh, those are the things that make it that much harder to open up. And it is fair to be a little guarded with your interactions with someone changing. But people change every day, and that's something where there's 30 million people in recovery in the United States, which is about 1 in 8 last time I checked. So you're in the McDonald's drive-through, 1 in 8 cars. There's 8 cars there. Somebody's in recovery. So you just don't know. And I think honestly, a lot of the reasons we don't know who's in recovery is people don't want that judgment. They don't want that, image in your head of what did I used to do kind of thing. Folks are different. I will not use the word addict. I would really encourage people, if they've never had a substance use problem, to literally never use that word. It's very judgy, very charged. Uh, there's other negative words that I'm probably only going to share here so people know if like the language not to be using. Like, it's not person centered. So addicts, junkie, degenerate is usually a term used for gamblers for some reason. Like, weak people, like all these negative terms. None of those are true, by the way, but we as a society have decided it's easier to judge a small group of people for some things. But I would really encourage person-centered, person-first language, people in recovery, people in addiction, the person's name, better yet, just calling them a person, because there's a lot of research that I won't just nerd out on about, like, when we are able to dehumanize someone, it changes like how we view them and then like how we're going to talk about something. So if people in addiction aren't human, then we can talk about this, or this. uh, and that's a problem.
Yeah. So it sounds like ultimately, if I know someone in my life that's struggling, the best way to support them is connection, using person-centered language, and just being there in the capacity that they need me to be there.
Yeah, the way you can afford to be there, because I
Hmm.
understand not everyone may eh, have space for that, so you could even say like, I love you, I care about you, I don't have the space that maybe you're looking for, but this is a space I can give you. Um, but truly, I guess I understand the anger. I respect the anger. I really do. And if your goal is to help someone change and move forward in their life, you cutting them up and down does not help that. There is a saying in 12 step, I believe it's AA. No one can beat up an addict like an addict. That is the only time I use that word. And that saying doesn't mean that everybody in recovery and addiction is tearing each other up. No, it means that nothing you're going to say to somebody is not something they've already said to themselves. Nothing you are saying to them is not anything they think about when they look in the mirror, getting up, dealing with their day to day life. It's not helpful, and you're not going to help them by doing that. They've already said all of that to themselves. So you just doing that is going to be very triggering. Um, yeah, if unless I guess you have a family member say, "No, I really want you to push me, tough love me." That's helpful. But I really think people need love letters, not war letters, when we're talking about
Hmm.
people in recovery and changing. And I just think about myself with my own mental health journey. If I had people in my face yelling at me, telling me what's what to change, I'll be honest, I probably wouldn't have done the work I've done to this point. If someone Obviously, there's consequences for actions, but very rarely is that going to be the approach. And I think most of us want to go and be treated with dignity, respect, and to be included in the process. And also, like, not everybody's ready to change. And I know how frustrating that can be as a friend or family member. That's not on you as a friend or family member. It's tragic, it's sad, and yet the only way we start to change some of this stuff as a society is being real about where are people coming from and where are they starting from and what are they maybe capable of doing.
Yeah. So, shoe on the other foot. I'm an individual
Mhm.
who has someone in my life who's severely struggling with substance abuse. And I'm struggling
Yeah.
to support them because I'm so angry and I have all the emotions and I'm grieving what they're going through. How can I best support myself so that I'm not projecting that onto this individual?
Well, I appreciate your honesty. Um, I think personal work is usually, the answer in some capacity, to know like what's coming up, what's being thought of and noticed. Um, I think another piece of it is just acknowledging that experience, and I really think just like someone in addiction or recovery needs community, we need community to deal with, and so it doesn't mean sharing everyone's business with everyone, but just having some folks that you can talk to honestly about how you're doing, what your journey is. That is why I'm such a big fan of Al Anon because they just talk about how addiction doesn't just impact the person that's using drugs or alcohol. It impacts friends, family, a community. Um, and I think talking about it just really helps. Just the feelings, yeah, I don't know. I carry some faces with me. Like I'll never forget. I started my career in corrections, halfway houses and things, and so some of my clients, unfortunately, are no longer on this earth, and I will never forget them. And also, some of my clients are doing really well, and are just doing some beautiful things in society. And others are, still doing beautiful things, but they're struggling. They're not there. Um, so I think it's almost just probably giving permission for mixed emotions and just knowing that it's not a thing that you can push or force either way.
Mhm. Yeah. So, if I'm an individual who is struggling with a family member, a loved one, a friend who has a substance abuse struggle, where can I find support for myself? Where can I find these Al-Anon groups? Where do I start searching?
a great question. I would say Al-Anon, maybe whatever you're most comfortable with. So maybe if you have a friend that's a therapist, or maybe a clergy member that is like doing some work in the community. Research shows that more folks are open to talking to someone they already know, and especially like a faith leader. Uh, so I think that's where I'm kind of just maybe thinking of, but also, yeah, if your insurance covers therapy, if you're wanting therapy, maybe you could go on Psychology Today and find someone that's able to support. Uh, I know a lot of therapists that are pretty addiction informed. That is, when I say I work with addiction related issues, that is a lot of the work I do, like couples in recovery or individuals like a family member that may be concerned or they have a wound and that's some of the trauma and they just want to talk to a therapist that's not going to, I don't know, freak out because they want to talk about. So this is maybe a shameless plug. Like us therapists are pretty cool, shameless plug. And a lot of them know what they're doing with substance use stuff, not always, but a lot of them do. And if you're like a friend or family member and you just need to be able to talk about stuff, I would really, the big set, I think 80% of therapists would know how to support that and have space for that and just make it about you. And that's the thing, maybe I would say, is finding space that's for you
Hmm.
alone, to have that support as a friend or family member, and just how helpful that is. Uh, and just knowing that that's like there's good days and bad days with that. It's not all, a Disney movie plot where it's great, it's hard, then it's great. Like sometimes it's real bumpy, peaks, valleys, peaks, just up and down, and that's normal. That's not like you as a person are doing something wrong.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a lot of options out there for both people struggling with substance abuse and people who are on the opposite end, and trying to help those individuals that we can reach out, grasp a hold of, and utilize. Um, I just want to thank you, Eric, for letting me put you on the hot seat. Hopefully, your pants aren't burned off at this point.
Oh, no, I sincerely love talking about this, and I'm sure if I listen to this, like my voice is kind of somber talking, like I'm feeling some things talking about this, but I think we need to have conversations like this. We need to be real about what's happening. Uh, and I appreciate the chance to talk about it. And also, just shameless plug, like Narcan is free at pretty much every health department. Ohio Harm Reduction will mail Narcan for free to your home. They are an amazing organization that I literally cannot endorse or recommend enough. I have a few tattoos. That's not one of them, but I'm considering. They are doing just amazing work. Uh, this may be more niche, but there are free fentanyl test strips that Ohio SOAR will mail. They don't even take your name. They will just literally mail uh, test strips. And just the only thing I would just say about carrying Narcan, that's not, how do I say this? Such like, is that permitting use or is that enabling people? No, I would almost just say like it's almost like if I have an EpiPen and I see someone an allergic reaction and I give them an EpiPen, like I didn't enable them to make a decision. Maybe something happened or whatever. And people can't heal if they're gone, dead and gone. And so that's the thing where like, we're trying to keep people alive so that they can figure out what they need to heal in treatment. Very complicated stuff, but that's a medical emergency. And I don't think we would have the same conversation if we saw someone having a heart attack or if we saw someone in diabetic shock. Like we want to do that. So basically, if you take nothing else away from what I'm sharing, is please consider carrying Narcan for free from the health department. You may just save somebody's life, and that is about as cool a thing as any of us are going to get to do in this life. Um, and just to be considerate, just maybe not thinking about attacking others just because you don't happen to have someone in that group.
Yeah. Well, Eric, I want to thank you for sharing your expertise on this. This is something I have not worked closely with, but I have both personally and professionally experienced. And it was very enlightening to hear like your professional encounters with this type of grief and the trauma that can also come from this type of grief.
Yeah, and I would just if something struck a chord with anyone listening and they need a space, to just get more connected. Like, I promise, if I get an email or a reach out of like I'm looking for more information or context on something, that is not an email I'm ever upset to respond to. So if anyone has a question about how do I find a meeting or support, please just give us a shout. That, or me a shout, or I know Tiffany would respond or send it to me. But at that, we need each other. We all need each other.
Yes, we are always here to help in the capacity that we have the ability to help.
Thanks for tuning in to this week's episode of Deciphering Growth. We hope you found our conversation helpful and insightful. Subscribe to our podcast for more episodes and check out our Patreon for more content. Don't hesitate to contact us on social media if you have any questions or comments. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time, keep growing.